It's okay. Hi, everybody. It is, I think, exactly 4:30. Oh, 4:31. I'm sorry, we're late. But I just want to welcome you to the Holy Family Church. And I said last year, I told the group, and I don't want to bore you, but this is so funny. When I bought this place and found the sign back in the back, Holy Family Church, it was the same name of the church that I grew up in Nutley, New Jersey, going to, which is so weird, I think, because there's not that many Holy Family Catholic churches. But this is desanctified, so you can all feel very comfortable in this space. And Witold, our speaker, did not want to wait in that room there when he found out that it was the confessional. And is that true? And he did not want to bring back bad memories. But I actually loved going to the confessional. I loved talking to the priest and getting bad. I like to get hundreds of Our Fathers and Hail Marys for doing stupid bad things as I was a child. Anyway, we have a very lovely speaker today, and who will be introduced by none other than Scott Cogneco, who's worked very hard for the Beatrix Farrand Society and brought us year after year really wonderful programming. And thank you so much, Scott. And again, welcome.
Thank you, Martha. It's so nice of you to share your church and yourself and your generosity. It's making a real difference for Beatrix Farrand Society. But I'm really here to welcome you. I'm the president of Beatrix Farrand, and so it's kind of appropriate that I do. It's just wonderful to see so many familiar faces, and so glad you could make it. But I also would like to point out that we have some distinguished guests here. We have Victoria Johnson, the author of American Eden. And if you haven't read it, you would love it. Okay, and Thomas Foltz, who Beatrix Farrand Society had the good sense to make a Beatrix Farrand Society Award winner recipient. He's here with us tonight, and so and of course Martha, but then while you're here, Witold. Okay, and I mean I could go on. Witold has been writing books on various allied subjects for 30 years now. So you all probably have one that you particularly like. But I think that the outstanding thing about Witold is just a fine mind and a great scholar. And it's a privilege to have him affiliated with Beatrix Farrand Society. And so with that, here is Witold Rybczynski.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. As Stephen Kotkin says, thank you for the honor of the invitation. I'm going to talk about, it's really a story of a particular place, which is both very typical and very unusual at the same time, as you'll see. And between about 1890s and 1930, it was a very special period in American architecture and gardening and landscape architecture, because wealthy Americans built houses with wonderful gardens. I mean, that's not so unusual, but it was the kind of serendipity of having clients and architects and craftsmen and artists and landscape architects and gardeners who were somehow all on the same page. They were not fighting each other, as sometimes happens in projects today. They were all working together and produced some really exceptional things. Another sub-theme is that we look back on this and we sort of, especially if you go and visit one of these places and you get a tour, it's sort of like Ripley's Believe It or Not. You know, this is how many yards of marble there were here, and everything came from France or England, and we sort of see them as purely monetary accomplishments. Oh yeah, they must have had a lot of money and they did this. And as you'll see, there's actually much more to it than that. Let's see. This phenomenon, this building program that was all over the country, there was a number of reasons for it. On the one hand, I told you there was this serendipity of the skills and money, not actually as much as today, but a lot of money for the first time. People could travel. Americans could travel more easily than in the past, and so they went to Europe. And you know, America by 1900 was one of the largest economies in the world. And yet, when people went to Europe, they said, we maybe have the biggest economy in the world, but you don't have the most beautiful stuff in the world. It's all there. And so that was an impetus for people to do things better, partly out of envy, but that's always an element in the arts. I mean, if somebody else is doing something, you want to live up to that. And there was a sense here we're the richest country in the world, and it really was the largest economy in the world, and we're not really living up to that in the way that people did in the past. And it was, of course, Europe had all this old stuff, and that was the stuff that impressed people. So this was a national phenomenon. It happened in Maine, it happened in Newport, Rhode Island, it happened in the Hudson Valley. Really, in any nice area outside a major metropolitan city, there was some sort of enclave of these types of houses being built. The one that we're talking about, Planting Fields, is on the North Shore of Long Island. And I've also put Jay Gatsby's fictional house here. The Great Gatsby was written in 1925, so it was almost at the end of this period. And Fitzgerald is a little bit smarmy about it, and he's looking down on it. And he describes, for instance, that's a description of Gatsby's house. It's actually a fair description of many of these houses because they were very much influenced by Europe. So they were chateaus, they were villas, and they were English mansions, the sort of thing that we watch on TV these days. It was only about 40 miles. The distance, Gatsby's house is built on the extreme western end of this phenomenon, and it goes a little bit further than the Planting Fields house. It's about 40 odd miles. I read recently that the New York Times estimated there were about 500 of these houses in that area, not all on the water, as you see. Planting Fields is inland, but there were, and they said 500 houses with at least 50 acres. That was their sort of cutoff point. And a lot of them, there were estates as big as 1,000 or 1,500 acres. So there was a huge range in there. And Planting Fields was on the larger side. So this was called the Gold Coast, because this is the beginning of when people from Manhattan are building these houses, some of them to live in. If you read The Great Gatsby recently, those houses are year-round houses. The narrator, who's not a millionaire, is living in a house and commuting to Manhattan, lower Manhattan, which is where everybody works. He's commuting by train. By 1900, you might be commuting by car because there was some high-speed highways had been built, toll roads connecting, roughly coming to about where Planting Fields is. Oyster Bay was about the furthest east. So the Hamptons hadn't really developed much yet. And if you went a multimillionaire, you went to the Hamptons. So you'll see one of the architect's parents, for instance, they had a house in the Hamptons, and that's where people who didn't have quite the resources would go. But this is the other theme. Geoffrey Scott was a great architect, great writer and architect, who wrote about the same period. This is from a wonderful book called The Architecture of Humanism. And he's not talking about American country houses here. He's really talking about architecture writ large, Baroque architecture, Renaissance architecture. He was very enamored of Baroque architecture, and the book, in a way, is an argument for Baroque architecture. But it's an important point he's making. You need money to build great things. There's no way around that, because you need craftsmen, you need durable materials, you need the time to think about for the designers to work it all out. It costs a lot of money, but that's not a guarantee. Just because a certain moment has a lot of money doesn't mean they're going to produce wonderful things. Our own period is a very good example of that. We're much actually richer than the Gilded Age. I wouldn't have said that 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I would have said, boy, this will never happen again. But it is happening again, but it's not as good. So it's not automatic. It requires, as I said, this serendipity of all these people with talent and money and desire and ambition, and all this stuff has to come together. The owners, of course, are the most important. They pay for all this. Not because they're not important because they have the money. First of all, they have to have a lot of patience, because it takes a long time to build these things. The story I'm going to tell you is about 25 years. So that's what makes this unusual. Most of these projects were built fast. You got an extremely skillful architect. Within a year, he could put the design together, and within a couple of years, it was done. And meanwhile, the landscapers were putting in, they had armies of craftsmen. So it didn't take a long time. But this project is very different. It's an evolution of many ideas overlapping. So it's not, I wouldn't say it was the greatest project. It wasn't like Biltmore House in South Carolina, where you have Frederick Olmsted, great architects, and it all comes together, and there's a great sort of vision of what it is. This is not a project with a vision, because it's a project of many visions, of people coming in and changing things. And so you'll see, they're all highly skilled people, in some cases very famous people, but they're working with what's there, and then they're pushing it forward, and then for one reason or another, it keeps going. So you have two sets of owners in this case. You have the initial people who built it, and then you'll see the house gets sold, and they carry on. You have four architects, different, the pair on the right, and then if you know anything about this building, for instance, that first architect is Grosvenor Atterbury, who designed the building we're sitting in. And you have landscape architects. You have three different landscape architects who work on the project at different times. All of this is spread out over this 25 years. So it's not that they're collaborating, they're sort of dealing with what each one previously has done. You have armies of craftsmen. I don't have pictures of the interior decorators, the suppliers of all this furniture. We're mostly European. And the masons and the people who did all the work. But you also had two quite famous artists who are involved in the project at different times. So it starts in 1904. So in 1904, the Gold Coast already exists, but this is at the east end of the Gold Coast. So they're kind of pioneering. It's only been a couple of years that people have been buying land at that part of the Gold Coast. And the owners, the first owners, are James Byrne and his wife Helen. Byrne is a white shoe lawyer. He's a corporate lawyer on Wall Street. So it's not a rich white guy, right? But not really. He's the son of immigrants. He's Irish Catholic. That's something you don't want to be in 1900. It's really a bad luck of the draw to be that. And he overcomes all that, as I'll mention in a minute, in actually a significant way. He goes to Harvard College somehow, I'm not sure how, but he works his way through Harvard Law School. He finishes very well, he gets hired by a good firm, and he ends up as a partner in a white shoe law firm on Wall Street. So I don't know enough about the practice of law at that time on Wall Street, but if you were a corporate lawyer, somehow a lot of the dollars seemed to fall your way. It wasn't just fees. It was some of the great country houses that on the Gold Coast are built by corporate lawyers, some of the really big ones. But he's a busy man. I mean, very busy. As I mentioned, he, for instance, was the first Catholic to be appointed to the Harvard Corporation, the board that runs Harvard University. There was a big to-do about it because he was a Catholic. And I mean, that was all, never mind that he was also Irish. He was also the president of the New York Bar, so he was a significant individual and a very good lawyer, clearly. But he doesn't have time to build houses and take care of all that. So it's really his wife who is the central figure of this first part of the story. And she's Scottish, of Scottish descent, although her father, I think, was second generation. So he was an entrepreneur in Terre Haute, Indiana. I don't know anything about how she gets to New York. There's just a blank. She doesn't show up until she marries James Byrne, and she's described by then as a New Yorker. Her father was an entrepreneur. He also was in real estate, so she clearly had some experience and background. And plus she had Scottish genes, which is unfair, but puts you ahead of most people in many fields. I speak as somebody born in Edinburgh, so I'm probably prejudiced. It was a late marriage. She was in her late 20s. He was in his mid 30s, so it wasn't a spring romance. They had 4 children, 4 girls, 4, I won't go into the whole story, but really significant people in their own right, judging from their marriages, and a boy who was actually born at Planting Fields. It was also unusual. Planting Fields was, as far as I could figure out, their permanent home. He commuted to Wall Street, but this was not a country house for the summer or anything like that. For them, it was a permanent home. Not so for the next owners, as you'll see. I wanted to show you this photograph because this is a passport photograph. She's 50 years old. She's not a flapper. She's too old for that. I mean, she's from another generation, but you can see a lot of, for me, she's a very modern woman. And this whole idea, I mean, we know, for instance, that the drawings, I got some of the architectural drawings for their house. It says a house for Mrs. Byrne, not a house for Mr. Byrne. So she dealt with the architects, she dealt with the tradesmen, because there are also letters from various tradesmen who are dealing with maintaining stuff around the house. So she was a significant figure. She was a significant collector of art. She had a large art collection, which you'll see some of it in the house. And she lends things to the Metropolitan Museum, so there's some important works there. She was a founding member of the Colony Club, which was an important club. She was Protestant and he was Catholic, and there's a funny comment at one point where one of Byrne's employees, one of his young lawyers, says, being himself, he married a Protestant. Which also is, I don't know how many Catholics are here, but at that time, Catholics didn't marry Protestants. I mean, Catholics didn't marry people in the next parish, never mind a Protestant. So it shows you, in a sense, his independence of mind. So she buys 163 acres near Oyster Bay. It's called Upper Planting Fields. It's supposedly an Indian name. It doesn't make sense in English because, of course, it's a planting field is like a double positive. Every field has planting of something. So, but that's where the name comes from. It's a name attached to this farm. It's a working farm, but she buys it from essentially a local person who's a kind of land speculator who buys up property and sells it and deals in it. And so he gets actually a very good price from her. It's not cheap. I forget, I don't have the amount in my mind, but it's in the hundreds of thousands of present day dollars. But what's unusual is that over the next 4 years, she buys 5 more pieces, and she ends up with 374 acres, which is a significant size, and they start planning a house very early before they even complete. You can see what she's doing. She's connecting to various roads. So on the bottom right-hand corner, that's like the back door. That's where the manure wagons can come in. The street at the top is the access, but she also gets a little connection to that street on the left side, which is a major road in that part of Long Island. She hires Grosvenor Atterbury, as you all know, who built this building. He built a much more elaborate and I think quite beautiful building, the Seal Harbor Congregational Church. And he was actually an imaginative choice. He wasn't a typical choice because Atterbury was not like most architects at that time who were revivalists. And the first question they would ask the client is, do you want a chateau? Do you want an English manor house? Do you want a hacienda or a villa, Italian Renaissance villa? And then we go on from there. He did do American colonial houses, if that's what you really wanted. But most of his houses are not stylistically, historically easy to categorize. We think of this as traditional. But it's not, there's nothing traditional really about it. It's nothing historical. He's not trying to recreate a particular period. And that's true in his other houses, and his most famous project, which is done a bit later than Planting Fields, about 2 years later, is Forest Hills Garden. And you can see it's sort of Bavarian in a way, but it's not really trying to, why should you be Bavarian anyway? He's not trying to be historical. He's a very skillful architect, and I show you Forest Hills Garden because that actually anticipates or follows along the kind of approach he took in the house. This is the Byrne house. This is what he designed for them. It's a really big house. This is a 100-foot facade, and there's 2 more wings. Another wing, and then there's a whole service wing with the kitchens and all of that stuff. There's this dramatic tower on the left side. It's built out of, he pioneered or at least innovated the use of burnt brick. So he's a kind of arts and crafts architect. The burnt brick gives you a lot of texture, and some of them are black, some of the colors, of course we have no color pictures because this house burnt down. But it's reddish, brown, black, that kind of dark color. And there's a lot of wooden, sort of almost Tudor, but not meaning to be Tudor, half timbering throughout the house. The interiors are not historical at all. They're just nice. They're not trying to remind you of particular. It's a shame we were trying to light up this thing because you can see over the fireplace you have a Madonna with Child because Byrne was not just Catholic, he was a very devout Catholic. Then there's a story by one of his employees who spends the weekend with him, and he says on Monday morning, he and the maids and the children go to church, and the guests and Mrs. Byrne and the butler all sleep in. And so, and there's even a kind of niche here, which Atterbury says would make a very nice chapel. But you can see it's a pretty grand house. It's a big house. There's nothing but very smallish about it. And this is the living room. It's a very traditional house because it has a drawing room and a sort of men's billiard room. So after dinner, the men can smoke cigars in the billiard room and the women can go, which is a kind of funny old-fashioned, given that the house in other ways is very modern. It has this long passage. You're looking down at that fireplace with the Madonna over it, and you can see all the rooms are a lot of prints, and mainly prints rather than paintings. But you can see it's very nicely detailed, but you couldn't really define this in a historical sense. Is it supposed to? He says it's like an English farmhouse, which is a very strange description because it doesn't look like a farmhouse at all, but it has this very elaborate woodwork. So kind of arts and crafts, but not looking rustic at all, quite sophisticated. Helen Byrne had a reputation as a decorator. As far as we know, this is all her work. She bought the furniture, and she didn't simply go out and hire a decorator. The plan is interesting because it's really beautifully organized. Atterbury believed that the movement through a house should be the way you organize it. So you enter at this angle into this tower, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you have this long axis which takes you to the living room, and on the way you have the billiard room and the drawing room. And then there's another axis which takes you into the garden, and that's a very important axis because it's actually still there. It was such a strong organizing principle. In the other direction, you have the dining room, and then the dining room with a porch off it, and then the kitchen and all the service part of the house. These houses had, we know this house had about 10 servants, and it had, I think, 6 bedrooms and 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 bedrooms, including guest rooms and rooms for the children. So it was these are large houses, and the service, the way that it runs, is very important to work out properly. And I think the plan here is a very sort of rational development of all that. What's unusual about Atterbury's house is most of the rooms connect to the outside. So for instance, these yellow areas are all outdoor areas that connect from the bedrooms. And I think part of the advantage of using his approach to the style or no style is that he can do that. It's very hard to design certain styles, like a classical house with little balconies everywhere. It doesn't work. I mean, you might get away with one big loggia somewhere. This house also on the south side has canvas awnings. If you put canvas awnings all over a Gothic revival house, it looks pretty weird. Whereas he has these, they're striped. I don't know what color they were, but I imagine like red and white or blue or white. So it's very kind of jolly, and you'll see a picture in a minute, I think. Oh, I did want to mention the 2 rooms on the right. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out what they were. I thought maybe the butler has his own little suite and the housekeeper has a room. But I realized from some research I did, these are bachelor rooms. That was a standard thing in a big country house, because when you had house guests, you didn't want the bachelors drank, they played cards, they stayed up late, and so they got rooms that were separate. And here they're very separate because they even have their own access from the outside. But it was a very common thing in English country houses to have a couple of guest rooms which were just separate from most of the other guest rooms, which are just mixed in with the family rooms. Here you can see the view with all these awnings, only on the south side, but important, of course, no air conditioning yet. They also hired a pretty unusual, or at least pretty effective landscape architect, Greenleaf, and it's hard to imagine he didn't change his name, but this was his name. He started off as a civil engineer. He was a professor at Columbia, and at some point he decided he wanted to go into practice. He quit being a professor, he went into practice, but his hobby was landscape painting, and he became, if you imagine you're building a big estate, you know, there are roads and drainage, so there's a lot of engineering stuff. And so he became a landscape architect for, he built about 30 big estates on Long Island and around New York City. His first big job was for the Vanderbilts in the Hudson Valley, that huge mansion they built near Rhinebeck. He was an important landscape architect. He became, for instance, he was appointed landscape architect for the Lincoln Memorial, which is an important job in Washington. He was president of the American Society of Landscape Architects right after Frederick Olmsted Jr. So in those days, it was important what your achievements were to become a president of an association like that. This is not a huge, he did some very big, ambitious landscapes on the Gold Coast. This is not one of those, but it's very thoughtful. So what he did is he took the axis that Atterbury had set up, the north-south axis, and then extended it and organized a sort of small garden near the house with a round water pool and a couple of structures, a pergola and a sort of sitting area. And then he continued that axis, and so there's a long arbor walk that goes south with the roses over it. And that becomes a sort of permanent fixture that organizes this place for ages. There's a wooden tennis court on the left, and that's a little playhouse, which is important because that plays a role later on. And then another arbor on the far left. And that's about the extent of his work, other than the access road, which you can see coming in, and that building on the bottom right is the stables, which included about 10 stalls. I imagine many with ponies for the 4 girls. And on the right-hand side, a carriage house and a sort of pass-through where they washed the carriages, and also then accommodations for the stableman. Here's a view from the house, probably from the upstairs, and you can see that long arbor walk that he created, and then the pergola on one side and the sort of sitting area on the other. So the house was finished. All this work was done in about 3 years, and they lived in it for a number of years. They said their 5th child, a boy, was born in the house, and then they did something odd. They rented the house. We don't know why. I mean, there was no sort of family. It wasn't a money thing in the sense that they suddenly ran out of money and there was some crisis in the family. It doesn't seem to be the case. They rented for about $1,000 a month, this house, which is about $30,000 a month today. So it was a significant income. And my best guess is that if you look at their previous life, they changed houses a lot. And while he had a good income, she was basically building up the family wealth they would buy a house, she would decorate it, or they would work with, they had hired Atterbury earlier to improve a townhouse in Manhattan, and then they would sell the house and move on. So maybe this was a plan that she had initially, and she rented it initially to a couple, the Coes, who we'll meet later, who had rented it for the summer. The next summer, she rented it to a man called Billings, who was a fabulously wealthy financier in Manhattan, and he was building a house next door, so he wanted to live nearby, I guess, while the construction was going on. And then the 3rd year, they sold the house to the Coes. Again, we don't know, was this a plan that she had, or was this, maybe the Coes just made a big offer? She got a lot of money for the house, I think close to 20 million in present day dollars, in a time when a dollar was worth much more. I mean, there's no income tax yet. Property taxes are very low. So it was a significant amount of money. It's interesting because the sale takes place when the whole family is in Europe. So the whole family goes to Europe for 2 years, because it took so long to get there by boat. And people didn't go over just for a few days. And so clearly the money from renting the house was paid for a lot of the travel, and then they maybe got an offer from the Coes and they sell it. I don't want to go into the whole story of what happened to the family, to the Byrne family after, but there is a connection with Bar Harbor because they bought Guy's Cliff as a house in Bar Harbor. It was a shingle house, and she hired Guy Lowell, who we'll come across in a little bit, to turn it into a villa. I couldn't get a picture of the villa itself. This is already probably 20 or 30 years after Helen Byrne dies, and her daughter either gives or sells the house to the religious order, which then takes care of it or doesn't take care of it, because the original house had Spanish tiles, for instance, on the roof. Here you can see there's some kind of asphalt shingles. It doesn't look very attractive. You get the feeling that it's not been taken care of very well, and they've stuck shutters on it. But this was the house where they lived, and she hired Beatrix Farrand to do the landscape. So the stepped terraces, which are still there, you can see. The house burnt down in the 50s, so the house is no longer there. Was eventually replaced by one of those College of the Atlantic buildings. But the landscaping is it's not there in terms of planting, but it's there in terms of the terraces and the steps and the balustrades and so on. So the second owners were William and Mary Coe. And they're both interesting people. Coe is English. He was born in England. He was brought here when he was 14, and a large family, I think 12 or 13 children. And he immediately starts working as an office boy in a company in Philadelphia. I think they live in Camden. So he doesn't actually go to high school. And the company he works for is an insurance company, which is bought by a much bigger insurance company, one of the largest marine insurers in the world, and he ends up running that company. So he's obviously an incredible character in terms of drive and abilities, given his very humble roots. And his family is not wealthy. They were in domestic service before. His father was a sort of factory manager or something like that, but clearly they emigrated from England to improve their condition. So he has that background. He actually marries a prominent woman, the daughter of a judge from Charleston, but she dies a year later. So he's a widower when he meets Mary Coe. She's often called May Coe, which was her not exactly a nickname, but the name that people use. She was, despite this kind of unimpressive look that she's giving you, she eloped from her family when she was 17 and married somebody. And it's important to know she's probably the richest heiress in America at that point. Her father is Henry Coe, who is a fabulously wealthy, a partner of John D. Rockefeller, and I'll mention a little more in a minute. But so when they meet, he's a widower, he's English, at least he's not Irish, but he's English, so he's not kind of a catch. But on the other hand, she isn't either. She eloped, she's damaged goods, really. Because she got married, her father arranged an annulment of the marriage, but nevertheless, so it's a kind of deal. They have 5 children. They seem to have had a pretty happy marriage, but of course, it made William Coe an extremely wealthy man. Henry Huddleston Rogers was her father. H.H. Rogers' nickname was Hellhound Rogers. He was also called the last of the robber barons. He was a partner of John D. Rockefeller, mainly because he had developed a refining system, and he sold his business to Rockefeller and then became a partner in Standard Oil. But one of his great achievements, he was a real doer. I mean, he wasn't a sort of stock trader. He built things, and one of the things he built was the Virginian Railroad, which was a railroad from West Virginia, which had anthracite, which was a very desirable, clean coal, to the port in Virginia. And that was quite a feat because he had to fight the big railroads who didn't want somebody like that coming in. And that became about half of his fortune because he owned it, he financed it personally. He didn't borrow money, he backed the whole project. And here he is with his chum, and you recognize him, Samuel Clemens. And Rogers is a very unusual hellhound because he has all these friends who are muckraking journalists, Ida Tarbeck. He had African-American reformers as friends. So he's an unusual guy. Again, a self-made man, much like Rogers. He comes from very modest beginnings and really creates himself. He had 4 surviving children, so when he died, she inherited a quarter of the estate of the richest man in America. And here's Coe with 4 children outside the house which they bought a few years earlier. Horseback riding was a very big part of being in that part of the country. There were trails all over that area, and so on. They hired a landscape architect. They didn't go back to Greenleaf. They hired Guy Lowell, the architect who has a fair amount of work in Bar Harbor. Lowell is a very unusual architect because he's an architect. He's a very skilled architect, but also a very skilled landscape architect. And not in the way of Greenleaf that he sort of did it as a hobby. He studied landscape architecture at the Beaux-Arts. He was a graduate of MIT, but he also studied at Kew Gardens. He wrote 3 or 4 books about landscape architecture, and he founded the landscape architecture program at MIT. So he was the guy that he could do your house and your garden, which he did often, or he could just do your garden. You had an architect for the house, but you hired him just to do your garden. So he was recognized in both. At the time he did planting fields, the time he was involved, he had just won a competition against really big names to design the county courthouse in New York City. And that was a huge project. It's there. I mean, it was built. But it meant he didn't have time to spend on this project. So most of the day-to-day involvement is Robson Sargent. Robson Sargent was the son of Charles Sprague Sargent, who was the founder of Harvard's Arboretum. And he's not a landscape architect, properly speaking. He graduated from Harvard College, but then he basically hung out with his father for a number of years and learned a lot about horticulture. And he was, which is important, he was Guy Lowell's brother-in-law. So he got a job with Guy Lowell, and I think by all accounts, he was a very skillful horticulturist. So, I mean, at one point, you can make sort of fancy plans, but at one point you've got to start planting things and dealing with that. And that was the side of the business he really understood. And plus, that sketch of Lowell is by John Singer Sargent. But Robson looks like a more fun sort of person to hire and have as a kind of advisor. Lowell looks a little bit forbidding, and he looks that way in most of his. And he's a Boston Brahmin. He probably was forbidding. So Robson Sargent really is the guy who is working with Coe. Coe has bought this, but he has much bigger plans than he wants to do more than Helen did in the first instance. He plants this arbor walk and extends it further. He, and presumably with Lowell's involvement, they designed this sunken flower garden with this green pool in the middle, and it's at one end is this structure which is a recycled playhouse that Atterbury had designed, but it's covered in brick, and it's now used and it's more dramatically used than before. Everett Shinn was the artist who painted and decorated the inside of what is now a tea house. So the playhouse became a tea house. It's hard to credit, but he's a member of the Ashcan school of painters who painted, bums on the street and homeless, and he did paint all that, but I think he had a very expensive lifestyle, so it wasn't enough. He had to find other ways to make money. So for instance, he worked in Hollywood for Samuel Goldwyn for a number of years, a kind of art director. And he did a lot of interiors, murals, interior decoration. He had worked with the architects that you'll meet in a minute, so it's possible they introduced him to May, but he did this really beautiful paintings at the end, that lamp made out of porcelain flowers. That's all his work. So here's the whole estate. There's a lot of more landscape work. There's 2 greenhouses. Robson convinces the clients that he says, I found this camellia collection, and it's from England on the island of Guernsey, and you should really buy it. There's like more than 100 plants, and so they buy it, and then when they bring it over, they say, oh, well, Long Island's very cold, they'll all die. We can't leave them out. So you're gonna need a camellia house. And so they designed this large greenhouse for the camellias. They also designed a palm house, and the whole development sort of moves south from the house. The biggest structure in that is the hay barn, which is really not a hay barn only. There's a silo, there's a creamery, a dairy, a stable. By this point, Coe has thoroughbreds. He becomes very involved in horse racing. And there's also accommodations for about a dozen farm workers in parts of this building. At various times, there were about 60 workers. So running one of these big places, it required a really large amount of labor. We know that because there are census figures for all this. So it's a large number of people to create what at least you can tell from photographs, and there's a little film that somebody shot, was beautifully maintained. It's very hard to find any gardens today that have that degree of care. The architects of that hay barn were Walker and Gillette. They had been hired by Coe about 5 years earlier to design a lodge. He had bought this large property in Cody, Wyoming. He became friends with Buffalo Bill, of all people, and Buffalo Bill sold him his hunting lodge, which was a kind of very rustic lodge, but Coe wanted a big house because he had a big household, and so they built this large, it's a sort of lodge ranch house. There was a ranch connection, but it was about 500 acres of stuff. And Stewart and Walker were the architects who did that, and so it was natural, once he bought the house at Planting Fields, to have them do any additional work that was required, like the hay barn. Walker and Gillette were both, Gillette was a Penn graduate, and Walker was a Columbia graduate. They met working in a big office in Manhattan. Walker had the connections, the social connections. He had married one of the developers, I think, of Tuxedo Park, and some of their first jobs were Tuxedo Park. Gillette, as you can see, he's the designer because he has round glasses. It's interesting because we think of this as that Corbusier started this fad for round glasses, but this is before Corbusier. So they really Gillette glasses, they're not Corbusier glasses. But he was a skilled. Walker was a socially sort of more impressive background. Gillette was from a relatively modest background, but clearly a very talented architect. He placed second in the Beaux-Arts entrance exams, which was really, most people didn't get in. And to place second, and he was competing with everybody, not just Americans, but everybody who was trying to get into Beaux-Arts. So he was clearly a talented architect. So in 1918 is a terrible year, and it starts off by Robeson Sargent dies. In his sleep, he's not yet 40, and it's not clear what the cause was, but he's died, and he's the main sort of advisor to the Coes about gardening and any affairs dealing with horticulture. And they're, as you saw, they're heavily now invested in gardening. And then while a few weeks later, they're in Southern California, it's wintertime, so they go to Santa Barbara. They're away, and the house burns down. There's repairs being done while the owners are away. Things are being, some sort of addition being done. A fire breaks out, and then it turns out there's not enough water pressure. They have to run a hose to another estate which has a pond and pump water. And by the time they get it all under control, the house is gone. So now they have this beautiful estate. They have all these elements except the house. The house really has to go back in the same place because Atterbury really chose the right spot. It's got the views. You can actually see the sound. In those days, you could see the sound from the house. And they've got all these garden elements, which of course haven't been damaged by the fire. So the house really has to go back to the same spot, and there's the access road. So you can't kind of start over. And Gillette is a practical person, so he's obviously willing to figure this out. The question is, what sort of house is it going to be? And by now, of course, he's working Coe is working with Walker and Gillette, so he's not going to go to Atterbury and say, come back and replace it or something like that. Walker and Gillette had actually done a very beautiful house only 4 years earlier for May Coe's brother. This is in Black Point in Southampton, and it's a very unusual house because it faces the sea, and then it has a garden in the back. And so how do you enter such a house? I mean, usually you enter from the front, and then the garden's in the back, so you've got front and back. But here, the front is the sea, so you don't want to break that up. So you actually enter the house from the narrow end. And there's a very skillful plan that gets you into the house. And so you're entering not on the big facade, which is like, so there's a lot of sort of architectural legerdemain going on. And this house won a prize from the AIA because they recognized what a good design it was. And certainly a Tuscan house would have been suitable for that sort of, for planting fields. But Coe actually had something else in mind. He wanted a Tudor house. And I imagine, in my mind, it's partly to sort of emphasize his Englishness. And also, possibly he just liked it more. He was only 14 when he left England, so it's not like he experienced it himself, but he liked that idea. We know that all his life he had an English accent. You have to work hard to keep your accent. I was born in Scotland, and I grew up in England. I came to Canada when I was 10. I obviously had an English accent. I don't know when. I lost it very quickly. Usually as a kid, you don't want to stick out that way, so you lose it. In any case, he told Gillette, I want a Tudor house. And what Gillette did, Gillette and Walker would send him books of old Tudor houses. At this point, American architects were designing Tudor houses, which were really modern American houses in a Tudor style. Whereas what he wanted was a house that really looked like a Tudor house, not just the style, but the whole appearance and the feeling of the house. And so he ended up choosing this house, Moynes Park, for one side of the house. He liked another house, so that became the other facade. And so the house is sort of put together like a patchwork, like a collage of things, which was not unusual at the time, but was clearly what he wanted. Here's the Byrne house, and the Coe house, you see, is a bigger house, and it doesn't actually reuse the foundations, but it does inevitably have that dogleg plan because the stable is already there, so the kitchens have to be on the right side, and there's a porch on the left side because that's a beautiful view, and then you've got this axis of the existing garden, so you've got to respect that. So it looks very similar. It's not true that he's trying to copy the other house because this is a totally different house. And as I said, he doesn't reuse the foundations. Plus, it's a bigger house. So that whole wing at the angle on the right it doesn't exist in the other house at all. What he does as an approach is a kind of scenographic approach. Like, what if this house grew in here, and then it went over there, and then the next wing was added 100 years later, and so of course it's on Long Island, so you have to suspend belief up to a point. But that was his approach, and this was not a completely unusual approach. Misner, for instance, in Palm Beach, his buildings are often like that, and he talks about them that way. He said, I want the building to look like it was a medieval building, then it was converted into something else, and then the Saracens invaded, and they added a wing, and that's sort of what they've done here. You can see there's a Tudor half timber section on one part, and then there's a intentionally awkward connection, and it turns the corner and becomes something else. It's sort of Tudor here, but if you walk through that cloister, it's actually very Gothic. It's got these intersecting vaults. And again, it's not a grand composition like a classical house would be. It's very much something that grew over time. And then the porch is almost Renaissance. I mean, I always liked that they added this ship because he was in marine insurance. So there's this sailing ship. They could have put the Titanic because that was one of his insurees, but I guess that would have been a bit, I guess Robert Venturi would have put the Titanic there. The entrance is actually very modest. The entrance is sort of the most modern part of it. It looks almost like Christopher Wren with those twisted columns. And over the door is this kind of cornucopia of stuff, of vegetables and fruits, and the name Planting Fields. So they keep the name. So they keep the name from before. But it's actually, compared to Atterbury, it's in fact much lower key, much more modest as an entrance. I'll just go through the plan quickly, but you can see it has none of the simple structure of the Atterbury plan because it's supposed to have grown sort of incrementally. So there's a kind of organic mix of things. There is a long, you enter a hall, which actually looks as if parts of it were outdoors before and then now are indoors. It's a very unusual design. The den is sort of his room and the salon is her room. So if the friends come over, he entertains them in a sort of Georgian den with a bar and so on. And hers, you'll see a salon very different. It's unusual because the gallery is what we would call a family room. It's really, the living room is the formal living room when you have company and so on. It's a very big room, very grand room. But the gallery is the sort of everyday room, and it's very much, the gallery has a minstrel gallery on one part of it, and you'll see here, I'll show you a picture later of the room. It's clearly a very Tudorish intention. Then you go down, there's a dining room, a breakfast room, and then the wing, the angled wing is all the kitchens and other things. Same thing with upstairs. I don't think it's as well planned as Atterbury's house because the guests are sort of with the adults, and then you have the children, and then you have a long wing with all the servants' rooms. There's more servants' rooms in the. There's about 20 house servants here, so there's rooms in the attic as well. There's the gallery, which has hunting trophies, Coe's hunting trophies from Wyoming, elk and longhorn sheep. And then the fireplaces tended to all come from Europe. They were taken from older buildings. But you can see this sort of Tudor medieval feeling of this room, very different than the living room. Trouble with Tudor is a kind of dismal because you have to have dark stained wood everywhere. And so you get this dark atmosphere. And I have the impression, and it's only an impression because there's no documents to back it up, that Mako was not enamored of this. It was kind of dreary. And of course, it was her money that was paying for everything. So you can see that at one point she said, okay, this is the thing, but I want something else. And so, for instance, this is her salon. I mean, it's a French salon. It's all actually designed by Frenchmen because it was all done by French decorators and French antiquarians. The original salon had Louis XV furniture. I'm not sure if that's the case. This is redone since the house was sort of brought back. But it's a completely different feeling. It has nothing to do with the rest of the house at all. And she also did this in the breakfast room. This is an incredible thing. So there's a room off the dining room, which is a breakfast room, and it's covered floor and walls and ceiling with Native Americans hunting buffalo and elk and animals, and on the ceiling, which you can't see in the slide, are vultures. So it feels like an odd place to have breakfast. But I have this feeling he was very enamored of the West. He had a significant collection of Western documents and paintings, which he donated to Yale after he died. So she sort of, I guess she convinced him to do this. Again, this had nothing to do with a Tudor house at all. It's the work of Robert Chandler, who's a really interesting artist. he's not a struggling artist, he's a Winthrop. So he has lots of money, he goes to the Beaux-Arts. It's probably as a student at the Beaux-Arts that he meets May Coe, because after this elopement scandal, she was sent to Europe for a number of years until things calmed down. And so she brings him in, and he does this work. He's very famous today for his screens. He did these beautiful, folding screens. They're enamel, but they're painted with incredible animals and various exotic things. And he did a lot of interiors. He did the Colony Club in New York and a number of houses. Probably the biggest one is Vizcaya in Coconut Grove. He did a swimming pool with where he decorated the swimming pool, but he used real seashells and real marine life, and it's a preservationist nightmare because it's all falling off. Imagine a swimming pool with all that humidity. And even the Buffalo one has a lot of intaglio, so it's sort of three-dimensional stuff and gilt and so on. He also did a room, again. This room was for various complicated reasons, was lost. So this is a reconstruction based on photography, but this is pretty much what it would have looked like. What's interesting is that things that look like lace, they actually were lace. He took lace and he somehow stuck it in and painted over it. He's very creative in that way. But you can see there's a very different aesthetic from the rest of the house. Finally, the architects, Walker and Gillette, had worked with Olmsted Brothers on a couple of projects, so they probably are the ones who recommended that they be brought in as landscape architects. And Olmsted Brothers was, of course, the firm founded by Frederick Law Olmsted, who retired around 1895, and John Charles was his stepson, and who was the sort of leading figure in the firm. And Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was much younger, but over a series of times they had different partners, but it became Olmsted Brothers, and it was the two brothers. The problem, or at least the sad thing for our project, is that he died in 1920. He was a lot older than Frederick Jr., and plus I think he traveled too much with all these projects everywhere. He was responsible for the Western work, all the Seattle parks, the World's Fairs, all of that stuff was John Charles Olmsted. So basically, most of the work on planting fields is called Olmsted Brothers, but one of the brothers is no longer alive, and Frederick Law Olmsted works with two associates who become partners. One is Percival Gallagher and James Dawson, or Fred Dawson as he was known, and they're the ones who basically take over all these residential projects. Because Olmsted Jr. was a planner as much as a landscape architect. He founded the Planning Association. He was its first president. He did studies for New Haven. So he was involved in these big projects. And all of these small residential projects, which were scattered all over the country, were the preserve of these two men, one or the other. And planting fields became Fred Dawson's project, probably because he had actually grown up in the Harvard Arboretum. His father was a gardener who worked for Charles Sprague Sargent in the Arnold Arboretum, and so he probably knew Robeson, so he was kind of a logical person to step into his shoes. Olmsted Brothers had a very large office, and it was probably the largest landscape firm in the country at that point. But I like to imagine that if there's some older people here, you remember the Wall of Sound? It was a record producer who produced, what was his name? Anybody remember? Spector. And he produced these very rich where he used the studio to sort of boost up the quality of the sound. And the Olmsted brothers do that with the landscape. When you hire them, you get like 150% landscape. Because look how rich this is compared to that earlier slide I showed you. I mean, everything is landscape. There are little things falling here, there are big things, there are huge things. It's layers and layers and layers. And they had this very professional office back in Brookline of guys who knew how to do this and did these planting lists and plans and all of that stuff. So somebody like Dawson didn't have to worry about the details. That was all taken care of back in the home office. So it's a very rich landscape. Here's one of those those long axes, north-south. And then he designed he laid out lawns on the north side of the house, which is not like sort of the Central Park type of open lawns. They had a lot of specimen trees that he added, and then he has the crocuses for the springtime. So, I mean, the big thing with these gardens is they were seasonal. So you got this happening in this month, and something else happened the next month, and so I mean they were real experts in all of this. They really understood it, and that was important in a lot of these country houses, including this one, because the owners were not there year-round. So they didn't want to come there and then say, well, last month it was terrific, but there's nothing there this month. I mean, it had to be orchestrated. And the Coes had the house out west. They had an apartment in the city. Later on, they had a hunting lodge in South Carolina. So the whole, and when in the summer, the whole household moved to Wyoming. I mean, they just left. The last project, Olmsted did a lot of little things. I won't go into them here, but they were basically on retainer. So whatever needed to be done related to the garden, or if they needed to hire a new gardener or build something or fix something, that was all part of his job. But the last big job he did were the gates, because Coe wanted real gates. An estate should have gates so you know that you're entering something important. And his sort of representative in England, he told him, try to find me something antique gates, something beautiful. And he did. The Carshalton gates were built in 1711 for an estate, which never got completed. The owner died before the house was actually built. So in the end, the land was subdivided, and the gates were bought by an aristocrat who wanted to erect them for his estate elsewhere. So the gates were taken apart and moved. And so the aristocrat, for some reason, changed his mind, so the gates never got re-erected. They were all in a barn somewhere in Surrey, and that's where Coe saw them, and he bought them. Quite expensive, several $100,000. And brought them over to America. And the gates are about 100 feet wide, and they have these pillars at each end with lead statues of Diana and somebody else Greek hunting gods, and some of the most beautiful wrought iron work, really elaborate, beautiful work. Coe's idea was to put this at the entrance, which was at the north end of the estate, but that was not a very important road, and Dawson convinced him that if you're going to install 100 feet of gate, you really need a proper setting, like a 4 setting, and then you need, after it, you can't just stick them in the forest. And he convinced them that they should use the southwestern corner of the estate, and then they could create a kind of forecourt. And he designed a road that twisted up the hill and then connected to the entranceway, and was beautifully landscaped. And it was a complicated project because Chicken Valley Road was actually the important road in that area. And so this required realigning the road to give enough space so that it wasn't a sort of dangerous entry point. And so it took about 3 or 4 years. So by 1930, it was done. And here you see Gillette has designed a lodge on the right-hand side and extended the wall, so the wall now, the gates have a wall. Like it's kind of, if you have gates without a wall, it looks kind of unusual. So they built a limestone wall and then landscaped the entry side here. Actually, the first time I went to planting fields, I arrived from this end, and I'd never been there. I didn't know what it was. The gates were locked, so you had to go around to enter the other side. But I remember thinking there's something really important behind these gates. And of course, that was what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to tell you, this is really big stuff, and you're going to see something impressive, because the gates really are very, very impressive. So the Olmsted brothers' involvement was finished by about 1930, and there were no major additions. There was a lot, I mean, when there were ice storms, trees fell down, things had to be replaced. There's a sort of poignant side to the American country house sort of episode, is that none of these houses lasted more than a generation. Most of them disappeared after that. Many of them were demolished. Many of them were changed in function. They became a seminary or a conference center or something. Because the truth was the kids didn't want these houses. Now, if you were the first son of an English duke, you didn't have a choice. You got the house, and it was up to you to figure out your life, and it changed your life, to deal with that. And of course, to deal with the maintenance of an ancient house and so on. But of course, in America, it didn't work that way. The kids just said, no, we have our own life. So the 4 children, the girl married 5. The girl married an Italian count, so she was in Italy. The oldest son lived on Long Island, but he didn't want this huge job. He was basically involved in running the family businesses. One of them lived in Wyoming because he's a sort of ne'er-do-well one who just wants to be a dropout in Wyoming. And one of them becomes a diplomat. He joins the Foreign Service, so he's mainly in Europe and not in America at all. So at one point, I think Coe, in a sort of down-to-earth way, realizes none of his kids want this. And if I do leave it to them, they'll just sell it, because that's what people did. And they sold it to a developer who cut it up into lots, and maybe kept the main house or maybe not. I mean, it was a kind of luck of the draw what happened. By this point, I don't know if he was so involved in the house, but it was the gardens. He had really invested himself in all of this landscape, and he didn't want to see it just disappear. So the house, it's a private residence for 42 years. It's not a very long time, but he decides, and he does something unusual, because he decides to give it all to New York State. Just all together, no, and people did that, but they usually sold it. So there's I think it's Montgomery Ward, or I can't remember the name. There's a 1,500-acre estate, Comset, and it's now a New York State park. But that was sold. The family, the children remaining after the father died, sold it to the state. He just gave it to them. The whole thing, except for the artwork and the furniture, which the kids could keep. Everything else went, the house, the greenhouses, the whole thing went to the state. So in 1955, from 55 to 72, almost 20 years, it belongs to the state of New York. And the state of New York, I suppose, doesn't know quite what to do with it, but he wanted it to become a sort of horticultural study center. Because he had the biggest camellia collection in the country. He had thousands of different kinds of rhododendrons. It was really a serious horticultural collection, and so they gave it to the State University of New York to administer, which of course didn't do what he wanted at all. They used it as a temporary campus for colleges they were building. So when they built Stony Brook on Long Island, they could set up a temporary campus on the Coe estate, and they used the old building. they added a lot of temporary buildings, geodesic domes and temporary gymnasia, things like that. The hay barn was turned into residences, boys and girls, and then the cafeteria in the middle. And so and then they did that again for Old Westbury, which was another campus. And then finally in 1972, partly because New York State had actually started a Parks and Recreation department, and partly because the education department had really gone sort of haywire and had spent too much money, was overextended. It was I guess it was mainly during the Rockefeller period. So they took it away from the State University of New York and said, okay, it's going to be run by the Parks and Recreation people, and they turned it into a state historic park and arboretum. So it actually became what Coe had wanted all along. And it's partly an arboretum, so there are classes. The greenhouses and collections are all there. It's also just a jogging park. I mean, there were a lot of trails, mainly for horseback riding, which are now walking trails and places for hiking. It's a large area, 300, and it's extremely beautiful, even in its diminished sort of form. It doesn't have 50 people taking care of it anymore, but it is really a beautiful place. And of course, like many of these old houses, it becomes a place that when you get married, you have sort of your bridal party goes there and gets photographed in these surroundings. I've never quite understood that. I got married in City Hall, but never mind. For many people, this is important, so it's sort of changed character completely. It's no longer private; it's public. It's been public longer than it was private. The reason I got involved in this, I'm writing a chapter for a book about planting fields, and I must admit, when I started, I sort of wasn't taken by Coe very much. He seemed to be one of those self-made people who are both pompous and very insecure at the same time. He was kind of horrible with people, with his various employees, the architects and landscape architects, always complaining about. He always went along and spent the money, but he had to have a lot of complaining first, about tiny amounts of money. And his house is not great, and I think a great house needs a great client, and he wasn't a great client. He was too picky and he didn't know when to give freedom and when not to give freedom and so on. But over time, I sort of started to get to like him a little more. And partly it was because, when he starts, he has racehorses and he shoots all these elk, and they're all sort of ordinary hobbies that you're supposed to have if you're him. But the gardening is not a kind of predictable hobby for a very wealthy man. And yet he gets more and more involved in it. He goes on trips and buys things and ships them back, plants, hundreds of plants. He visits things and visits various landscapes in England, and so it really draws him in, and it's I think the main reason he wanted to leave that to make sure that all this would not disappear, because landscapes, as any landscape architects know, can disappear really quickly. If somebody isn't taking care of it, within a couple of years they're gone, so I should have said he set up a private foundation to make sure that the state had outside support to keep it going, and indeed that's what happened. So, as I said, there's that little saying, the achievement was not predictable, but it was also, in a sense, the most important thing he did. It wasn't creating the house and the garden. It was leaving it all to the public and then having it made in such a fashion that it became a very successful. Several 100,000 people use this place basically as a park of one sort or another. And I think that, in a sense, was his greatest achievement. Thank you. I've run a bit long. If you're a teacher, you're programmed for 90 minutes. That's a class. So this was closer to 90 than I expected. But if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them on this or anything else. Thank you.
Just a quick.
Yes.
I'd like to know, when you were last on the grounds, if that magnificent cedar of Lebanon is still there. Offhand, it's just probably.
I don't know. I don't know.
Does anybody else know?
But there is a good, you remind me of a good story about trees, because